Okay, so today I want to talk about what the programming that I feel like is destroying Western culture, specifically like in the US, right? Because obviously a lot of the success and the ability that we have to grow, bring food, have lots of resources has come as a result of capitalism, right? And capitalism is basically this idea that within a free market we can create industries or, chains of supply that allow, goods from one world or one part of the world to be moved to the other and then basically create profit along that way or capital. And that was what allowed interconnectivity within around the globe, right? So that idea of being able to freely trade and have that transit, that changing of currency creates a movement, and through that movement of energy, that money, we're then able to create and build resources in other parts of the globe with information, resources, and, brain capital, basically the ideas and the capacities and abilities of other people to build these and replicate these capacities in different parts of the globe, right? So, like, you can take people who are really smart over here and then move them to places where there aren't those smart people, and then they can build the same things over here that you would have over here. And that's why, like, especially in the United States, you can go in most places and you'll see a lot of stores that are the same. In most places in the country in the US, you'll see a Dollar Tree, you'll see, McDonald's, you'll see all this. All this is capable because of capitalism. Now, I think the programming that is killing us, that's really bad though, is because capitalism is survives in diversity, right? So capitalism grows, and the idea of it's always replicating, creating more and more industries and stuff like that. And the issue though is that as humanity grows and advances in one capacity, so like for instance, we like in New York, they used to have a bunch of horses, right? And that's how the transportation would happen in New York. And then they had to like clean up the crap in New York, and it was really gross or whatever. And then all that went away as soon as they invented the car, right? And then the industry, instead of like selling barley and all this food for horses, suddenly you see a lot less horses being used, and thus they're not being bred as much. And you see all that industry going into gas stations, right? And because, 80, 100 years ago, there wasn't gas stations everywhere. But eventually, all these gas stations got built because now this new technology existed, right? And that created this network. And the issue is though is that like gas in some areas might be more prevalent or sold more than gas in other areas. So this is why you'll see prices in New York be a little bit higher than like places in Alabama. But obviously that's regulated and subsidized by the government and da 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 da. Anyway, so if you understand that basis, that capitalism exists within diversity, where I think it's destroying and killing our programming is that within that American dream to supply capitalism, you have to have multiple communities that are dependent upon these systems, right? Like the only reason a supply chain works is because multiple people depend on that, right? If only one person, two people went to a grocery store, it wouldn't work. You wouldn't have a relevant grocery store. The only reason a grocery store works is because everybody goes to it. And the grocery store works and everybody goes to it because it is easier and you get more variety of goods in one place for cheaper prices than you would if say you had to go from one store to one store to one store to one store and then gather all this. It's the convenience of it. So that convenience is what drives all these people to it. The problem is with that is that that's not sustainable, uh, especially in places where, like, if you have one store or two stores, when you want to build competition and you create multiple stores and they all start offering the same thing, you're trying to create and get more capital, more profit, but there's not actual any you're not offering a larger commodity, you're not offering any more than the diversity of store you already have. So in order to do that, you then obviously you create a bunch of fake brands. Like there's like three major food companies in the United States, but it looks like there's all these different food companies because what they do is they create all these other smaller companies and then they split that out and make all these different brands. And so people will buy different types of cereal, different types of food, all this stuff. But it's really going to the same three places because this sense of variety is what creates this diversity, right? And it creates the diversity of market. But also in a diversity of market, you need in order for it to keep growing, because the idea of capitalism is that it just keeps growing, right? But obviously, if you know anything, uh, nothing just keeps growing, right? No human being, no animal, no creature, everything, nothing just keeps growing. And in order to sustain something, you need to focus more on sustainability and not growth. But capitalism, as it's turned and transformed, has become something that's like sort of this malformation, consumerism. And consumerism now is all about like, okay, now basically before it was let me go to the grocery store for a few things, let me go to the gas station for gas. But now what happened is as these systems have become generationally expected, because before 100 years ago, your average kid had three pieces of clothing. You know, they had like a Sunday wear. If it was a girl, she had maybe two or three dresses. And then, you know, her night dress. So she had maybe five, six gowns. If they were really wealthy, they might have had 20 or 30. But now the average kid now has like seven pairs of shoes and like, you know, like 10 pairs of pants and all these shirts. Like just the median amount of wealth that is represented in the average American family is so much higher than even like upper class people had 150 years ago, right? Like there's so much wealth, especially in the United States and in Western culture, right? Because of capitalism, right? But the problem is that has created consumerism because people are now no longer we have access to so many more things we didn't have access to, and because those goods were brought so cheap, we were able to bring more of those into our lives. But then in order to sort of build the American dream, right, there was a lot of things they had to implement in our minds to make that sustainable. So if you understand that whole scenario, you'd be like, okay, well, if we're just going to keep growing and growing, how can we keep growing? Well, you can keep making more people and having bigger and bigger families. But the problem is that bigger families actually work contradictory to capitalism. Let me explain. So if I have one person in a house and they're paying that bill on that house, right? Let's say it's $2,000 a month. That person needs to make $2,000 a month to pay that bill, right? Now, if I have two people living in that house and these are two fully functioning adults, right? Now, these two fully functioning adults only need to pay $1,000 to live in that house, right? And then, so these people are able to buy more, but in terms of their living situation, oh, they only need to live in that one house, right? And so they're like, okay, well, this is good. So then what happens if you get 3, 4, 5 people living in that house? Well, then what happens is that person's only paying $400 per person. So what that means then is that you can no longer, those people don't need to make $2,000. Each of those people only need to make $400. And so now because they only make $400, right, the amount of pressure and labor actually goes down, right? Now, why is that important? Because you see, back in the day, it was about 1978, I think, right, when we went off the gold standard in the United States. And when we went off the gold standard, what happened is we no longer could back our capital with physical gold, right? Because that's not what backs our currency. But remember, we're trading all this money and stuff across the world or whatever. But you can't use a finite resource to back an infinite demand, right? Because demand for goods and growth in a growth economy, it's infinite. It never stops. So how do you back that up if you don't have gold, if you don't have silver, if you don't have physical goods, right? Well, what happened is consumerism leads to something called a service economy, right? So if you go into the United States, about 80% of jobs are based in the service economy, which is the idea of a service economy is the waiter at the store. The service economy is the guy who stands the clerk at checkout. The service economy is the secretary who you call in, or the customer service rep you call when you order something online. That's the service economy. And so much of our economy is based in this service, because in the United States they couldn't we didn't get rich and famous, like rich and powerful making stuff. We didn't make the best cars, we didn't make the best like horses, like we weren't selling these things, like, or these animals or these fruits or these resources, because there's only so much of that to go around. And once you have a network that can exchange all that, you can't really just grow that, right? So then how do you grow that? Well, you grow that by creating services. That's the stores, that's the restaurants, that's the everything that does something for you. A laundromat, instead of having someone clean, you clean their clothes for them, right? That's a service you're doing. And that's what brought so much wealth in the United States, and that's what's created wealth in a lot of Western countries. But the difficulty with that is that when that keeps growing, right? You don't have any way to actually back the currency. The currency is what allows that exchange. It's what creates that network and allows that network to exchange itself. Sort of like veins in your body, right? Like it's sort of pumping blood. But imagine if your body gets too big, eventually there's not going to be enough blood to pump through the body. So in order to do that, you have to put more blood into the system. And that's why, if you know, like really, really tall people, their hearts will eventually fail and die. Because there's not enough, and the heart can't pump that, because you need a bigger heart, you need more blood, everything needs to get bigger. And the thing is, as things get bigger and bigger, the resistance to that growth becomes exponential, right? So it gets harder. So what does that mean? It means that, I'll give an example. So for a car to go from 0 to 150 miles per hour, it requires about 300 to 400 horsepower, right? So to go for 150 miles per hour, right, to at max speed, you need about 400 horsepower. To go another 80 miles per hour, so to get to 230 miles per hour, that same car will need about 1,200 horses. So to just go 80 miles more, you're going to need 3 times more power, right? So the resistance becomes exponential. You get more and more resistance. So why you're like, well, Oni, why are you saying this? Why is any of this important? This is why this is important. Is going back to that home example, right? When we became a consumerist economy, right? The only way to keep that growth was the United States had, and like a lot of countries, because the United States is the World Bank, and the standard of that, because the US currency is the reserve currency for the world, that currency got backed with the labor of the people within the economy, right? Because the only way you have infinite growth is if you're having infinite service, right? So infinite service is the idea of you working and you doing stuff within the economy that create that momentum. But obviously it gets more and more resistant as we're going on, and we're starting to see that with bubbles and stuff like that, but I don't want to get into all those details. But if you understand that sort of resistance growing, what that happens then is that they don't benefit from having you work less. They benefit from having you work more. And this is why this is so poisonous, right? For instance, why is it, and the reason I get bad at this is because I watched a video that says, this guy is talking about, how do I evict my son at 24 years old, right? And his son has a daughter, and they're living in their house. And, he's like, man, my son needs to go out and live on his own, and like, he needs to get his own house, and I'm just trying to get rid of him at 8, like, he's 24 years old, I just need to get rid of him. And I'm like thinking, why is that normal? Like, actually think about it. Why is it normal when we're becoming so rich, so powerful as people, to live separate from each other? Think about noble families back in the day. They would all live in a single estate, right? That's why they had mansions. They didn't just have mansions to flex on people. They had mansions because it was a shitload of people living in a giant house, right? And they were all living together because they understood, all these people, it's better to have our resources here, create a family culture and a house. That's why it was called the house, House Stark, House Tyrell, or whatever. It's the house, right? And then that creates nobility. And what's funny is you've leveled up a tremendous amount of people of culture into nobility, or into the ranks of nobility, but they don't understand why nobility worked, right? So what happens is now you have these people who are like thinking like peasants. Oh, you need to go out and spread and do that. But where does that programming come from? Where does the idea of kicking your kid out of your house? Oh, he should be working on himself. Like, I don't know why he's living here. That you don't build wealth that way. Because think about it. That one dad is going to be sitting in his house paying rent. And it's funny, you'll read the comments and you'll literally tell people who be like, oh yeah, my kids were with me and then they started paying rent and we were way happier because it reduced the stress in the household. And then what's crazy is that when you do that, you can live and grow and have a bigger house. And then when everybody's working all these different jobs, right? Instead of having to spread that money to a bunch of different landlords, your daughter's paying a landlord over here with her husband. You're paying a landlord over here with your house or whatever. You're paying another person. Who's the person that benefits from all of this, right? And that's the thing that people don't understand. It's the landlord. Well, who is the landlord? And people don't understand. The landlord is the bank. So the bank, back in the day, the Federal Reserve, basically backs all the banks that you see in the United States. Like, it backs every single one of those banks. And it's the large bank where they all get their money from. And then because they realized, oh, hey, we don't have a gold standard. We can't back that up currency. So we need people to work. Well, how are we going to get people to work? We're going to give them loans, right? Because we can't let them own anything. But we're going to tell them that they own everything. So we're going to give them opportunities to own things with loans. And then what happens is when they start lending out loans and you get access to all this easy money, a house that was once $10,000 now becomes $100,000 because through the market economy and through the growth, that price has to keep growing. That's why houses are so expensive now. That's why housing is so crazy now. Because back in the day, they were giving out all these cheap loans and all these people who had capital and the ability to get access to these loans through the bank bought all the houses and they became the landlords. And they don't realize is like those people are just working for the bank, right? Because when you work for the bank, who's backing up their currency? Because remember, the bank doesn't have the money. They don't actually have it. Where is it coming from? It's coming from you. It's coming from your labor. And how are you forcing that labor? From having to work a job that you don't want to work. And then what's happened is in order to do that, they're like, oh, we have to push a culture of independence. We have to push people to go and do shit on their own. Who does that benefit?
So, my wife and I
Does that
recently had
boost anybody else? Oh
one of
yeah,
our
this
kids
is
move
the
back in
video
with us.
coming on.
Okay.
This is
Not,
crazy.
not,
Yeah, and he's talking about trying to kick his son out. And it's like, dude, why do you think like this? Right? And it's that mentality that is keeping people poor. It's that programming. Because it's like the reason you think, oh, I gotta be independent. I gotta do this on my own. That's nonsense. And you know why I can say that? The richest sub-demographic in the United States is Asian Americans. And the richest sub-demographic of those people are people from India. Because when people from India come over to the United States, you know what they do? They all live in the same house. They all spend their time getting educated. So instead of a kid and a husband having to work a job and then try to go to school and then try to raise his kids and trying to do all that, and then having the daughter do that over here and having another kid do that over here and three people, you know what happens? They all get together and like, you know what? Why don't you all live here? You can go to school. And then when you go to school, you just focus on doing school. So what happens is that kid, instead of having to work a job and then pay rent and then take care and do all this, he just goes to school. So then he gets fucking good grades at school because he kills it because he's not splitting his attention because his family is taking care of him. And then because he's being taken care of, he grows. And then because he killed it in school, he gets a kick-ass job. And then because he gets a kick-ass job, now he's bringing more money in. But you know what? Instead of being like, oh, now I got a bunch of money and I'm just going to go out and be independent and do that on my own, they put it back into the house, back into the hole. So instead of taking 30 years to pay off that loan of the house and be enslaved to the bank, they do that with 1, 2, 3 kids and they pay off that 30-year loan in like 7 years. And then what happens is they do that with the one house, right? And then they'll be like, oh, you know what? We don't need to do it for a house. Let's start a business. And we'll buy a hotel. So we'll buy a bunch of hotels and then this guy will manage that hotel and this guy will manage that hotel. And then they start buying a bunch of these businesses for these kids. So now these kids are starting to bring in all this money and all this wealth, right? And then because he didn't have to go and pay his rent over here and be a little pedestrian peasant over here, he was able to build something with his family. And because people were patient and they worked with each other, now suddenly these families are able to go out and they start buying everything. And you'll be like, well, what's the proof of this? Next time you go into a convenience store, look at who owns it. Next time you go to a hotel or a motel, look at who owns it. Next time you go to like on a taxi cab, look at who owns that. And you're going to start noticing very quickly when you go into, Apple stores, when you go into like convenience stores, start just looking who owns this shit. And then you're going to start seeing these brown, dark Asian faces everywhere. And you'll be like, wait, they own everything. Yeah, because they don't spend out and they don't kick their kids out at 18 because they know how to have a proper family culture. But remember, a proper family culture, right, allows you to excel in a consumerist culture, but it doesn't allow the consumerist culture to excel, right? So that's the contradiction of capitalism right now. And a lot of people don't understand that. And then you have these ideas and these mindsets of like, oh, I'm going to go out and I'm going to be independent and like, I'm going to kick my kids out at 18 and I got to go prove something on my own. And then they all just stay poor because it's too hard. And capitalism understands that. And then they make it too hard because their loans keep getting higher and higher and higher. So the same price that we used to buy a house, remember before when someone could buy a house working one job? You can't do that now. You can get multiple people working a house. They couldn't do it. And then what happens is people become more self-centered, more egocentric, more narcissistic. So they don't get along with anybody anymore. So now you have all these people who are homeless, living in cars, doing drugs, drinking, and like fucking around everywhere. There's no stable families. And you know who that benefits? The bank. Because you are then, in order to do that, you have to struggle to make ends meet. And then when you struggle to make ends meet, you will work a crappy service job. You will work in a shitty call center. You will work in McDonald's at 40, 50 years old. You will work some crappy service job that you do not want to do, but that powers our service economy from that very structure in the beginning. And you will be forced to do it because you don't have any other options. And you don't have any other options because you don't have any support, because you never got a proper chance, because you got kicked out at 18. And because you had to prove it and do it yourself. And that is literally the culture that is destroying the West. And people don't understand that's not sustainable. That is not sustainable. You can't keep doing that. It's not sustainable. And so this idea that, oh, we're going to go and we're going to build it up and we're just going to do it all on our own, that's false. It never worked like that. No one ever did that, ever. And it's never going to happen. But so many people believe that and perpetuate this idea. And they're like, oh yeah, I believe that because, it's about putting it up by your bootstraps. It's like, right. And that's why you are perpetually under the guise of of homelessness. Like you're always paycheck to paycheck. You're always struggling. And you can never build any actual wealth. Because you don't band together and you don't work. Like literally, if you want to break wealth, you should just and the thing is, this is why leadership and all this stuff is so important, because if people want to like break wealth, you should literally just get a group of friends who say, okay, for the next 10 years, we're all going to live together. We're going to support each other. And over the next 10 years, we're going to put all our resources into supplying each of these people. And then just have 5 people who aren't greedy sons of bitches. When one person starts doing well, they bring it down and they trickle it down to the others. And then the others go and they build their thing. Now, the difficulty is that you need people who are willing to contribute and go out, right? This is where you have to have that's where the culture really comes in. Because a lot of people, once they get a free ride, they sit around and they don't do anything. But this is the problem with always relying on the government in a capitalist culture. That's why it will never work. Like, handouts are not bad, but they're bad when they come from the government. Because the government is only giving handouts because that enables those who are working to work harder in the service economy, right? When you do it within individual families, then it's really, really beneficial. Like individuals, as communities, we need to start helping and supporting each other. But when you put that support in the government or on larger entities to take care of it, that only supplies and strengthens the demands of the service economy, which then strengthens the demands placed on the people who are literally the backing of the economy. Right? Because the reason the American dollar is so strong and we keep it, even though it's losing power every day, because that exponential resistance is starting to happen, And we're starting to see that with inflation and the cost of living. So it takes 3 times more work to get the same result. The reason that's starting to happen is because these people are being enslaved in their work. And Gen Z, proud to say, they're the ones who got stuck with it. They're the ones who got stuck with the bill. Millennials, we were old enough that like you had opportunities that if you were able to get into college and do everything around our age, early 2010s, you were able to get into something. And if you knew how to navigate it, you were able, but there's still a lot of millennials who fell into those cracks. But Gen Z, that's the generation that's just gonna fall right through those cracks because they they got screwed. Now, the internet has enabled a way out of that, but the internet is it's basically the maximizing of the service economy of the single individual. But that's a video for another time or whatever. But basically that programming, this idea of I'm going to do it myself, I don't need anybody, and this independence and the idea of forcing people out before they were truly able to take care of themselves powerfully and competently and not supporting each other, that culture of independence is what is destroying Western culture. And that is why our economy is doomed to collapse, right? Like the Western culture is doomed to collapse. And like, say what you want or think about Donald Trump, he is delaying the inevitable with his policies. He is delaying the inevitable. But if you kept going down that other route, you're just going to see a beeline to the collapse. And that's what we saw the last 4 years. The economy and everything after the pandemic, you saw all that speed right up. And so, yeah, and you know what started that? Government handouts. And once again, I benefited from that. I loved that. But I recognize that all the money in the world cannot make up for a lack of support structure. If you do not have support structure, you can't make it. So that's where it's like that money that's being used for handouts. And if I was president, I'd be like, we need to start supporting families and like as government. And then I would do as much what I can to localize it and really encourage the more people who are living in a household, the more money you get. More and like having plans for stuff. Because the idea is you need people to, but the thing is that works contradictory to the bank. And the government literally has no interest in moving contrary to the bank. The government and the bank are not going to fight. They're in league with each other. That's why our policies are the way they are, right? But that's why if you know how to navigate that and you can create a family culture and you can create businesses and you can do all that, you win. You just win because you get beyond that. But it's so difficult to navigate that on your own, or it was until you had the internet. The minute the internet came out, like the only reason I know all this and can do it is because of the internet. So that's the solution. So if you're like, oh man, like, well, how do I do it? Because I am on my own. Well, get really, really good at understanding the power of the internet and what you can do with it, with online marketing, understanding how to sell digital assets, understanding what asset classes are, the 4 ways to make money. Like those are your way out. But if you're trying to do things the old way in this new system, you're cooked. And that's what's killing our culture. Is so many people are taught to go to school and get out of the house at 18 and make sure you go to school and get a degree and da 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 da. And they're being set up to fail. And Gen Z is starting to see that. Gen Z is starting to see like, oh, this actually doesn't work. It's setting people up for failure. And that's what we're seeing all over the place. But people aren't catching wise, and and we just take these assumptions. We assume this culture, and we're just like, yeah, like 24 years old, he should be out on his own with his wife and stuff like that. And this guy's talking about like how he's disappointed in his son or whatever. It's like, dude, the only reason you think that is because you've been brainwashed. Right? And that's why this guy, because the thing is, if he was truly wealthy, he wouldn't care that his son's living with him if it was truly wealthy. Right? But he's not truly wealthy because the guy doesn't know how to build wealth. Because if he did, he wouldn't be bothered by his son living there. He would understand, okay, this is the vision for a family. This would be a man who has a vision for his family, but this man doesn't. He just wants his kid out so he can work his crappy job, so he can stay with his wife, and they can kind of semi-retire after working until they're 70 years old. And that's what they're going to do. And so it's dumb. It's so dumb. And this is what's killing our culture. Anyway, that's the video. I didn't mean to talk this long. It's a 30-minute video. But it's like, that is what's killing our culture. And like, I explained it out. It's that globalization, economy, capitalism. It needs that. But you have to understand, if you don't learn how to ride with those forces and work them to your advantage, you're going to be subject to those forces. And that is what most people in Western civilization are. You are subject to those forces, especially if you are doing well. If you are middle class or upper middle class, and you're like, man, I'm living on my own. I can afford my $2,000 rent, and you're making like $7,000 a month. Those are the people who are most vulnerable to collapse because you're winning in the system. So because you're winning in the system, you think that's how it works. But you guys are going to be the ones who get squeezed once you lose your jobs. So anyway, I'm just frustrated about that because I listened to this video and I was just like, I just thought this guy was so dumb. And I was like, man, he can't see it. But so many people are brainwashed like that. So anyway, that's the video for the day. And hope it was helpful. Peace.